Hey there, this is Paul from PropelAuth. Today, I want to talk to you about API key authentication in your PropelAuth application. If you've ever used a public API, chances are you have used an API key. With PropelAuth, generating, managing, and verifying these API keys couldn't be easier. In this video, I'll first show you how to enable the API key hosted pages, which are automatically generated for you by PropelAuth. These will allow your users and organizations to generate and manage their own API keys. Then, we'll create a backend endpoint that is protected by API key verification. Let's get started. Here we are in the PropelAuth dashboard. Let's start by heading over to the API key settings page. Here we have the ability to enable and disable personal API keys as well as organization API keys. Personal API keys are tied to your user's account and meant to be used by just that one user. If you enable this setting, every user in your application will have the ability to create and use personal API keys. On the other hand, organization API keys are tied to the organization as well as the user who created them. Enabling this setting will allow users with certain roles in an application to create and delete API keys. If you're wanting to limit who can create and manage API keys in your app, org API keys are for you. Let's now cover the final setting on the page that allows you to configure the different expiration options presented to your users when they create API keys. You can select which options are allowed, as well as the default option. I personally like it when my API keys never expire, so I'll set that to never. Now that we have our API key settings configured, let's create some endpoints in our backend that accept and validate API keys. In this example, we'll be using PropelAuth's Express library to protect our backend by requiring API keys to be included in request authorization headers. We can do this with any of our other backend or full stack libraries, such as Remix, Go, Rust, Python, and more. I've already installed and initialized the PropelAuth library, so if you haven't done this already, please check out our quick start guide and come back when you're done. Here you can see that I've already created a simple hello world-like endpoint. I use the validate API key function from the PropelAuth Express library, and then pass the authorization header from the request into it as an argument. This function will make a request to PropelAuth to validate the API key. If it's a valid API key, it will return information about the user or organization. If it's invalid, it will return with an error. No matter what, if a user created the API key, then we know it will return some information on that user, including their email. This is how we're able to return the user's email address in the response here. If the validate API key function returns an error, we can use this try catch to capture it and then return a 401 to the user. And that's it. You can see that in just a few lines of code, you can add API key authentication to your backend. Next, let's log into your app as a user, create an API key, and then test this out. Back in our PropelAuth dashboard, let's click on Preview in the top right, followed by Account. This will direct us to our app's hosted pages. So we're now seeing what our users will see when they go to create their API keys. Since we enabled both personal and organization API keys, you can see that we have menus for both on the left side of the page. On the organization API keys page, users with the API key permission can view and delete existing API keys, as well as create new ones. Let's create a personal API key. When we click on the new API key button, you can see that the default option of when the API key will expire is set to never, just like how we set it. You can see we also can select other options, but like I said, I like it when my API keys never expire, so let's go ahead and create it. Let's now copy this API key, pull up Postman, and test out the endpoint we created earlier. So here we are in Postman. I've already added the URL for the endpoint we created earlier. I've also set the key for the header we're using to authorization, and I'll paste in the API key we just created as the value. Sending the request now, you can see that we receive a 200 response back, as well as the response body that we set. And if we were to make a small change to this API key and then send it again, you'll see that we receive a 401. So everything's working. And that's it. Thank you for watching this video about API key authentication. If you have any further questions, please check out our API key documentation or reach out to support@propelauth.com.